We may not like it, but we can't say that corruption in Argentina, as in most countries, is anything new. The truth is that since the first government meeting back in 1810, virtually no Argentine government has been free of suspicion. Yep, the possibilities are almost endless and the incentives are very, very generous. And don't think it's just a matter of sticking your hand in and you're done, because most corruption cases, they're far more convoluted than this. However, what has been uncovered in recent years, it does go much, much further. We're talking about the realization that in Argentina there has been a systematic process led by the nation's own government with the object of looting the country's public treasury on a far larger scale. And we're not talking about the occasional bribe, but billions of dollars that, given the evidence, seem to have been stolen during the Peronist governments of Néstor Kirchner and Cristina Fernández de Kirchner. More news comes almost daily, but the goal of this video is to tell you how it all started, what happened, and how this plot worked. A plot which the very presidency of the Republic was involved in, as well as dozens of politicians, judges, officials, and many of the most important businessmen in the country. Folks, this looting operations plot, known as the Notebooks, began with the arrival of Néstor Kirchner in May of 2003 and continued under the presidency of his wife, Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, until 2015. That is to say, the systematic pillaging of the public coffers happened for more than a decade. Now, before we look into what this consisted of and how much money it meant for the Argentines, we have to answer some questions about the real protagonists of this story, the Kirchners. We need to look at who they are, how they got into power, and how they managed to set up what is perhaps the biggest operation in the history of stealing from Argentina's public coffers. So listen up.
Viva la patria!
Kirchners' ASCENT.
Two provincial politicians who managed to own Argentina for years. So it all began with a beautiful love story between two young university students. Néstor and Cristina met in the mid-70s while studying at the National University of La Plata in Buenos Aires. Love soon bloomed, and in 1976, after the military coup led by Lieutenant General Jorge Rafael Videla, our two lovers decided to leave and work as lawyers in the city of Rio Gallegos in the province of Santa Cruz. A city, by the way, that is far away from the capital. Indeed, it's more than 2,650 kilometers away. If we had been asked about that couple's particular future at that time, we probably wouldn't have mentioned anything about national politics. However, after democracy returned in 1983, this nice lawyer couple joined the Peronist Party, and it was there, folks, that the career of those who became Argentina's Underwoods really began. Well, now that we actually think about it, it was probably the Underwoods who became the Kirchners of the political series. It was a relationship made by and for power. First, in 1987, Néstor Kirchner was elected mayor of Rio Gallegos, and a few years later, in 1991, governor of the province of Santa Cruz. Then, finally, in 2003, he became president of the Republic of Argentina. And during this time, Cristina Fernández didn't stay on the sidelines. She made her career in the legislative chambers as provincial deputy, national deputy, and national senator until, in 2007, she arrived at the presidency of the Republic. And then, in 2015, she went back to the Senate. Yes, it seems like the Kirchners had it very, very clear. Between the legal profession and politics. More than 30 years of living off taxpayers, certainly something of a career. However, just a moment here.
Teníamos y tengo una determinada posición económica que ha sido producto de que he trabajado toda mi vida y he sido una muy exitosa abogada. Ahora soy una exitosa presidenta también.
The province of Santa Cruz, which is where the Kirchners began their political career, isn't only far from the capital, which after all is the center of power, but in 2001 its population didn't even reach 200,000 inhabitants. It was about 0.5% of the country's entire population, which at the time was approximately 36 million people. So, how did two politicians from a place that is so far from the core of power and so small take control of the entire country? This is the question that many journalists and political analysts have been asking for a long time. Well, now we're beginning to unravel the answer. Basically, this husband and wife duo took over, co-opted, and bought almost every sector of Argentinian politics, through the power of their wallets.
Porque nosotros no lucramos, Clarín, no lucramos, tenemos convicciones, tenemos ideas, Clarín, no lucramos. No estamos en el negocio de la política, estamos en la transformación de la patria.
Businessmen, trade unionists, judges, journalists, artists, and civil society leaders succumbed to the power of the state's wallet. It was billions of dollars distributed among the pockets of those who supported and were unconditional supporters of this peculiar marriage. A clientele network fed and greased by concessions, aid, and subsidies that were conveniently distributed and which nobody controlled. However, the question that we have to ask ourselves is, how did they finance it? How did the Kirchners maintain such an ample wallet? Well, listen up.
Compramos 300 vagones, 0 kilómetro. Cada uno de estos vagones nos salió $1.090.000.
The goal of public work.
Look at what Cristina Fernández said in 2010.
For us, for this administration, public work isn't a contingency. It's a conviction, a structural political concept that we've been developing not only since 2003, but since we gained the responsibility of directing a community's destiny. Cristina Fernández de Kirchner.
Well, now we know why public works were so important for this marriage. And no, I'm sorry, but it has nothing to do with Argentina's interests. Public work was one of the core parts of the Kirchners' political fabric, first in the province of Santa Cruz, and then throughout the entire country. Now, some of you might be wondering, well, Simon, hold on a second, how did the system actually work? Well, you'll see that deep down, it was actually quite simple. President Kirchner, through his Minister of Federal Planning and Public Investment, Julio De Vito, who stayed in this post for the entire period in which the Kirchners headed the country, met periodically with the main construction companies in Argentina, which in turn were convened by the president of the Chamber of Construction, Carlos Wagner. Well, in these meetings, it was agreed exactly which company would get each public tender. That is, essentially, they were meeting to decide how to distribute the cake. Then, when everything was decided, the tender procedure actually started, but this was simply for mere appearances. The company which was chosen was the one that this kind of public works cartel had previously agreed upon. And now comes the key to the entire process. Once the work was granted, the companies charged the first installment of the contract, the advance payment they needed to supposedly begin working. However, this payment was given entirely to the politicians.
Uno de los motores del crecimiento en estos años ha sido sin lugar a dudas la construcción, no solamente con la inversión del sector privado, sino el Estado.
So, hold on a second. Where was the business if these companies had to pay back what they charged? Well, that was in the extra costs. See, it's estimated that on average, each project's extra cost ranged from between 30 and 40% of the total bill. That way, if work was granted for 100 million, budget expansions were approved for up to a total of approximately 140 million. But that's not all. Sometimes the government would also approve changes and new project expansions until the company that had been awarded the $100 million work ended up charging a lot more. 180, 200, 250 million, and even up to 2.8 times the initial budget. So in this example, 280 million. And to top it all off, many of these projects, they weren't even finished. Yep, you heard that right. Of course, in exchange for this bargain, companies paid bribes to politicians, depending on the case, between 10 to 20% of the invoiced amount. Having said that, have you ever wondered how public work functions in your country? The thing is that this thing worked perfectly for years, but now, well, it's been exposed.
Tendría que disfrazarme de pobre para ser una buena dirigente política.
Yo siempre me he sentido muy orgullosa de ser parte de esa formidable clase media argentina, pujante, emprendedora.
Y de paso dirigirme a todos amigos, compañeros y funcionarios que tengan algunos dolarcillos en plazo fijo. ¿Usted moreno no? Bueno.
Discovered.
The little details really count here. When one doesn't take care of all the details, even the most complex and ingenious operations run the risk of collapsing. This case was not an exception. See, it turns out that the driver who transported the government's bribe collector was obsessed with writing down each trip, each stop, each building visited, the name of the people he was going to see for the briefcase delivery, even the conversations he heard during his travels. He had written down practically everything in 8 notebooks. We don't know if he did it on impulse for entertainment, if it was part of a kind of control and accounting system, or perhaps he simply wanted to cover his back. The reality is, though, that these notebooks contain all the details of this mafia plot. And finally, those notebooks came into the hands of a journalist who, upon seeing what they contained, decided to turn them over to justice. And after months of investigation, at the end of July 2018, high officials and businessmen linked to this plot were arrested. But that's not all. Now, many of these people have decided to collaborate with the Justice Department in exchange for benefits, such as not being in prison while the process continues. And one of those individuals is Carlos Wagner, the president of the Chamber of Construction, the man who called the companies and one of the people who benefited most from this entire mess. His story confirmed everything the notebook said. And the other testimonies, they went in the same line. But right now, I'm sure you might be wondering, well, alright Simon, but how much money are we really talking about here? Well, the reality is, it is a ton of money. See, if Carlos Wagner is telling the truth, the Kirchners would have received almost $3 million a day. And they did that for their entire 12.5 years in government. That is more than $12 billion in total, and that's only from the public works. Besides just the public works, there are many more suspicions of corruption and pending cases. They essentially got $12 billion to pay politicians, judges, journalists, social leaders, and of course, fill their own pockets. Everything indicates that this is how the Kirchners came to power and consolidated that power over Argentina. For example, there's also Jose Lopez's case, a former public works secretary and someone who was very close to Julio de Vido, the Kirchner'S minister who managed the plot. Well, in June of 2016, having been alerted that the police could raid his house as part of an investigation, he decided to leave at 3 a.m. with $9 million that he had in cash hidden under his mattress. Anyway, that night, Lopez tried to hide the money in a convent, the convent of the praying and penitent nuns of Our Lady of the Rosary of Fatima. But this didn't have the best of luck. While he was stashing the money, a neighbor who thought that it was a robbery called the police. And that's how good old Jose Lopez was caught red-handed. And yes, we know where all that money probably came from. By the way, as you can imagine, this money couldn't simply be transferred to a bank. No, it had to be paid in cash so it wouldn't leave a trace. It was moved in bags. Well, since they made so many payments, the people in charge of filling the bags already knew how many money wads fit into each bag, so it seems that the money was no longer counted in millions, but simply by number of bags. By the way, do not forget that companies also made money by overpricing, so the damage to the Argentine people has been even greater. Anyway, dear viewer, this is the gruesome story of how some politicians decided to plunder their own country. If the facts are confirmed, even the Underwoods would be scandalized by Argentina's situation. So, will Cristina Fernández end up in jail? Well, only time will tell. So I really hope you enjoyed this video. Please do hit that like button if you did, and don't forget to subscribe for brand new videos. Also, don't forget to check out our friends at Reconsider Media. They provided the vocals in this episode that were not mine. Also, this channel is made possible because of Patreon and our patrons on that platform. Please consider joining them and supporting our mission of providing independent political coverage. And as always, thank you for watching.